How can religious freedom not be used to advance the cause of Islam unintentionally?
It's very difficult, is the honest truth. It's very difficult. The amendments to the Marriage Act were actually the answer to this, the amendments that never got up. Because the amendments to the Marriage Act named the religious beliefs that were going to be protected. And it was belief that marriage is a union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others voluntarily entered into for life. It was that religious belief, and they called them related beliefs, in other words, beliefs that come from that then flow on to human sexuality, family, and gender. That was the answer. But the Parliament said no. And so now we're in a situation where we're looking at the possibility of generally worded religious non-discrimination or generally worded religious freedom. So rather than naming the beliefs, it just says religion. And fine, they will probably find a way to confine that to organised religion and recognised religions, but Islam is definitely a part of that. And this is one of the real challenges that we face in the modern world. I'm not someone who says that that doesn't matter, because I do believe that Islam is one of the spirits of Antichrist in the world, denying that Jesus is the Son of God. And I think we have to be very, very careful.
I want to ask this question when it comes to the issue of Christians in politics. If Christians are not going to be ministers of God, who is? If Christians are not going to be servants of God, who is? If Christians are not going to get up and make laws that reflect what is actually right and what is actually wrong, who is? Because, you know, we live in a time when these things are changing rapidly. You know, we've talked a little with Sophie's talk in particular about the Judeo-Christian heritage upon which we're built. And there's so much about that did the job that God would have governments to do, which is restrain evil, which was put in place laws that reflect the truth of what is right and what is wrong.
Do you know, I used to think, though, that ultimately this was a battle for freedom. I used to think that what we had to do was fight for freedom and engage in that secular language of religious freedom and freedom of conscience and freedom of this and human rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I'm not so sure anymore. And I'm not so sure, it hit me when we had a guy called Wilson Chowdhury from the British Pakistani Christian Association come to Australia. Wilson Chowdhury's been one of the guys who's been sort of leading the funding and the advocacy around the case of Asia Bibi, for those of you who know of her, the woman in Pakistan who was convicted of blasphemy and put on death row for 10 years in solitary confinement. And he's been advocating for her and funding a lot of what's going on there. And that's still a bit of a mess, but it seems like she's finally going to be free very soon. Wilson tells the story of how Asia Bibi was convicted under blasphemy laws in Pakistan. So if you blaspheme the Prophet Muhammad, you die, you get put to death. And what did Asia Bibi say that precipitated that conviction? She was being abused and beaten by Muslims who were accusing her of doing something wrong, and she looked them in the eye, her persecutors, and she said, "My Christ died for me. What has Muhammad done for you?" And that was it. They beat her, they did all sorts of unspeakable things, they put her into jail, she was on death row, that was it. And it struck me then that the problem in Pakistan isn't primarily the lack of freedom that these laws bring. It is the fact that these laws are universally and nearly exclusively weaponized against the truth. Who gets convicted of blasphemy in Pakistan? Christians who tell the truth about Christ and Muhammad. I think of the apostles in Acts, you know, John and Peter. And what happens? They're out preaching and they get hauled into the Sanhedrin, which I call the ancient anti-discrimination tribunal. And they get hauled up And the Sanhedrin say to them, you need to stop speaking in this name. So basically, there's a hate speech law that's been enforced against them. And they leave that place. And actually, later on, it happens again, and they get beaten by the Sanhedrin and strictly told to stop. And they leave that place having been told by the authorities that they're not allowed to do what they're doing. And I think to myself, well, in the modern age, what would we do in response to that? Do you know, would we leave there and have a strategy committee and get together and say, all right, folks, I think we really need to go easy on the trigger words. Let's not say Christ. You know, that really puts the Jews off.
You know, I always give this example of the anti-discrimination tribunal that Peter and John get dragged into, and they get told, you know, stop speaking in this name. Do you know when they left that place? They didn't do any of the things that we'd probably do if we were a Christian ministry and we got a angry legal letter from the Human Rights Commission in our mail saying you need to stop speaking this way. You know, we'd probably have a strategy committee and we'd probably sit down and think to ourselves, how can we alter what we're doing to please the Human Rights Commission? And we'd come up with a whole bunch of things. Or maybe we won't use trigger words like Christ, the anointed. The Jews get really upset about that, so we won't do that. We'll take that bit out. You know, maybe we won't go near. We'll put safe exclusion zones around the synagogues because that's, you know, difficult. Even though a lot of people are willing to listen in the synagogues, it's also where the angry people are. So we won't go there.
There is no doubt that conditions of peace bring to us a degree of responsibility. It means that religious freedom is good. Freedom for the truth is desirable. Why? Well, one reason is the Church of Jesus Christ can get on with the job. People can come to a knowledge of the truth. But also, just to connect it to the first part of what I was saying, it does also mean that government is fulfilling its ministry under God as well. Because what it means is that the government is not punishing godly lives, but that the government is rewarding godly lives with a peaceful and quiet existence. And rather, the punishment of the government, the judgment of the sword, as it says, of the government is falling where? Somewhere else. It's falling on those who are evil. And so Paul says, pray for this paradigm.
Next question is, what does it mean, you said earlier in church, what does it mean that you don't believe in human rights law?
Yes. It depends what you mean by human rights. That's the first important thing. Ultimately, I don't believe in that phrase and that concept because what it assumes is that humans have rights. They have something that they can assert over against the world that rightfully is theirs. I don't accept that concept. And I don't think that concept is found anywhere in the Bible. And the only reason we found ourselves there was that in the post-war era, when they legislated international human rights, they had to find a grounding and a basis for absolute statements of freedom and rights and dignity. And they gave it the wrong answer. They said the basis is in the human person. The fact that we are humans, we have rights. That's what they did. That's a completely upended, wrong way of viewing the world. You think of how Jesus describes our responsibility in this world. He says it is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. His entire statement of our life here is around duty, not rights. The only question you ask is, what am I obligated to do to God and my neighbour? You do not say, what am I entitled to? Nobody ever tells you to say that in the Bible. And instead what you do is you live life out of duty. Now, there's a problem there because everyone says, well, if you've got a duty to someone, it means they have a right. It has to. That's the other side of the equation. Well, not in Jesus' world, because he says, no, you love God. Why? Because God has the right. He claims it of you. And you love neighbour. Why? Because your neighbour has the right? No, because God desires that of you too, because he made you and made your neighbour. So God has all the rights. He's the only being in all the universe that can assert that over against the world and say, this all belongs rightfully to me. We have duties and duties alone. It's the same with the state. The state, what? It has a duty to God to be his minister and servant for righteousness. We are commanded strictly to submit to the state.
Why? Because it's our duty to God who ordained the state for our good. It's all duties. Sorry, folks. No rights.
So human responsibilities.
Human responsibilities.
Human
We need to legislate some of them. Yep.
Thinking about laws and policies, why is it okay to impose Christian values on non-Christians?
Well, because Christian values are good.
Because they're true?
They're true, they're good, they're beautiful.
What other values do you want to impose on people in the force of law?
What do you mean?
Like, what other values
Well, exactly.
would you
I mean, you've got to impose something else if it's not God's. And God has said, this is the world, I made it. This is the parameters around which it operates. And the best thing that we can do for people, the best thing we can do for the world, is to call them to that paradigm. And as I said about all the things before, for the sake of children, the next generation, for the sake of, just basic love of neighbour, and for the sake of the opportunity, which it ultimately comes down to proclaim Christ and witness in the world, you need that freedom, you need that respect for truth, you need that love. If the law enshrines a lie, like same-sex marriage, you find that God's view of that thing becomes against the law. And so the freedom for the truth on that issue is diminished. Right? And that happens always. If you have another value enshrined, the truth about that issue is pushed to the back. The truth about that issue is a weather vane for litigation. We're suddenly in a situation where the truth itself is inhibited, as Paul said. And so there is just always an imperative to ensure that the truth of God is upheld and respected.
And it's actually a good thing because as Christians we sit under an objective standard of truth and goodness. Whereas if it's just might is right, the person who has the power can impose their version of morality. They're under no restraint.
Look, this is the paradigm in Romans 1. It is either worship and serve creator or worship and serve creature. You're going to do one or the other. And if people are basically little gods and they're saying what I desire, what I want, my version of the world should be reflected in law, you're going to walk into a situation that's very, very, very dangerous indeed. And what you're going to end up with is total fragmentation because you don't have God's standard. You have people saying, no, I reject God, it's my standard.
Exactly.
It's one or the other.
And where biblical Christianity has spread, so has liberty. Because there are people who go, I'm actually not the ultimate ruler. Jesus is the ultimate ruler, and I'm accountable to him.
I didn't go into it, but if you read 1 Timothy 2 on, where Paul, for some crazy reason in that moment, where he's like, pray for the government, pray that the truth would be free, for there is one God and one mediator between God and man. I'm like, why would he just throw that in there? And it's the simple fact, as Peter says, there's two authorities. There's God and government. Fear God, honour the king, says Peter, right? And the reality is that if government hypertrophies, if it gets out of its jurisdiction, if it starts to take too much control, if it gets in the way, it can actually demand of people that which is inconsistent with them serving God. And it can get in the way of our duty to the ultimate authority, which is God. And so if you allow the government to do that, you're in a terrible situation. You need liberty. This is why the view of the world is liberty, because there is a higher authority which people must be free to serve. And the government needs to stay in its proper square.
Yeah, it restricts the government.
It restricts government. Otherwise, you've got totalitarianism, and the government is the only authority, and it controls every aspect of your life, which is not right.
What political strategies has ACL put in place to reinstate Christian values back into policies and governance at federal and state level?
Look, there's a few things. I mean, one of them obviously is the lobbying. But you'd say, well, lobbying is dealing with symptoms largely.
Lobbying is dealing with, we're a bit downstream from the problem. You've got politicians doing bad things, and we're trying to stop them and trying to be a good voice for truth to prevent that from happening. But there is something else we're doing which is exciting. It's been going on for a number of years, which is that we have the Training Institute, the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, where we have a lot of people who have gone through and been trained, who are interested in public life, who are interested in policy, who are interested in all of that sort of stuff, and they're all now working in more, Prime Minister's office, ministerial offices, political offices in state and federal level. We have
Actually, can you give more of a plug for that, the Lachlan Macquarie Institute?
I'd be thrilled to.
We have a lot of young people here, and I know one of the guys from our church went through it a number of years ago, but I don't think we've had many more.
Was that Alex?
Yeah.
Yes, Alex currently works with me now in Canberra, and he's a good egg. So we've had a lot of good people go through it. So LMI is our training institute. It runs a number of programs. The ones that are interesting for younger people are firstly one called GPS. GPS is for people who are at university or considering university, roughly in the age bracket of 18 to 25. We're a little bit flexible at the edges sometimes, and it's 8 days. And it runs in winter and it runs in summer, January and July, I think. And you come to Canberra for 8 days, and we always have a few dozen young folk from around the country. Quality people, actually. Really good to meet them, get to know them, but also the lecturers and the quality of the content is off the charts. It's brilliant. And it's a basic course about Christian thought, Christian worldview, an introduction into some of these concepts and topics. Everyone invariably loves it. I've yet to meet someone who says they didn't enjoy it. But then there is the longer form one, which is for university graduates, which is LMI, the 3-month course, or 14 weeks, I think it is. In that 14-week program, you do intensive theological foundations, you read theology on politics and governance throughout the history from the early church up to the post-Reformation. You do political theory, and you do parliamentary placement, and you join the alumni network. I did it. It was great. It's how I got into the ACL world. If you're interested in that stuff, it just introduces you to this world that you're like, oh my goodness, this exists. Like, there's really good Christian people out there doing amazing things, and they all happen to be here. And that's worth doing for those who have a particular interest in this stuff. And a lot of the alumni are now strategically placed, actually. And even right now, there is a federal parliamentarian who is an alumni of the program and is a very, 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 very good person. Yeah, so we're getting places.
That's great.